A veiled figure stepped from the fog, not quite grieving, not quite real, and behind her, a portrait waited that should never have been painted. When deception is framed in elegance and grief becomes a mask, the truth hides in silence and in oil. This is a case of shadows, obsession, and a warning hidden in plain sight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was during the waning days of October in the year 1894 that Sherlock Holmes once again found himself adrift in the murky spaces between cases, those rare periods which he endured with the temperament of a man denied his favourite poison. The fog that settled over Baker Street in those weeks seemed to echo his mood precisely. Dense, silent, and immovable. Holmes spent hours at the window, his Stradivarius balanced beneath his chin, drawing from its strings long, sorrowful phrases that seemed to narrate a grief neither of us could name. I had grown used to this pattern, the melancholy that set in when his singular mind was left unstimulated. But something in his silence on this occasion struck me as more reflective than restless. There was, I fancied, a shadow in his gaze that even music could not dissolve. It was on one such morning, when the mist clung thickly to the panes and Mrs. Hudson's tea had gone untouched, that the sharp rap of a visitor's cane echoed through the flat. Holmes, who had said not a word since the night before, looked up abruptly, not with surprise, but as though he had been expecting that very knock. A few moments later, the door opened to reveal a figure whose poise commanded the room before she had spoken a single word. She was tall, draped in widow's black, and wore gloves that seemed too new for mourning. A heavy veil concealed her face, but I could discern from her posture the careful arrangement of her grief, too symmetrical to be sincere. She stepped forward, not hesitantly, but with a theatrical precision, and I confess I felt a chill, though the fire still burned in the grate. Holmes had not risen to greet her. Instead, he remained seated, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze not on her veil, nor on her trembling hands, but fixed, unwaveringly, on her left boot. I followed his stare and saw nothing at first, but then I caught it, a faint smear near the toe, the sort one might acquire while stepping across an oil-stained floor. The lady had not noticed his scrutiny, nor had she yet spoken. The silence stretched, charged, and deliberate. Finally, Holmes broke it, not with welcome, but with a remark so quiet I nearly missed it. "You have come far," he said, eyes still fixed on the blemished leather, and not from church, I fancy. The woman stiffened, just perceptibly. I knew that look in Holmes's eye. The game had begun. Holmes stood at last, moved not by politeness but curiosity, and circled the visitor with the air of a naturalist inspecting a newly captured specimen. "A widow," he said softly, almost to himself. "Most certainly, but recently painted." I turned sharply, unsure whether he referred to the woman or a portrait of one. She gave a small gasp, muffled by her veil, and clasped her gloved hands tightly. "I beg your pardon," she said, the tremor in her voice now more authentic than the rest of her bearing. Holmes did not answer her directly. Instead, he turned to me and added in a tone almost playful, "Watson, there is such a thing as grief worn like borrowed clothes. And one must ask, who did the tailoring?" Before I could make sense of it, he motioned her to sit, and the true business of her visit was finally to begin. She removed her gloves with a care that struck me as practiced rather than nervous. Her name, she told us, was Mrs. Lavinia Templeton, and she had been widowed just 3 weeks prior. Her voice possessed a delicately constructed sorrow, soft enough to arouse pity, but never so tremulous as to lose control. It was the sort of voice, I thought, one might prepare in a mirror. Holmes remained entirely still, his eyes never rising above her cuffs. "I have come," she said, "not to clear my husband's name, but to trouble his death." At this, Holmes blinked, just once, and leaned forward. "Indeed?" She nodded. "They say it was an accident, or perhaps suicide, but I believe it was neither. My husband did not fall. He was pushed, or frightened into falling." Her hands, now bare, gripped the edge of the chair as if to anchor herself. Holmes said nothing. He studied her posture, the press of her fingertips into the wood, the exact curvature of her spine. I knew him well enough to recognize the signs. He was not listening with his ears. He was listening with his eyes. "My husband, Simon Templeton," she began, "was an artist, a modest success, though by no means celebrated. He worked from home, in a studio on the second floor of our house in Hampstead. It was from that very balcony he fell." Her voice faltered briefly, though I suspected more from effort than emotion. There were no witnesses. The police concluded it was either an accident or self-inflicted. He had, they said, been under strain. But She paused and gathered herself. "I know my husband. He could be difficult, reclusive, even erratic in his passions, but never suicidal." "And yet," Holmes interjected, "no signs of forced entry, no broken latch, no struggle." "None that the constable noted, but there was something else." At this, she reached into her handbag and produced a folded photograph, which she passed to me with a look of hesitance. "I found this, after his death, tucked behind a stack of blank canvases in his studio." I looked down. It was a photograph of a painting, one of a veiled woman in mourning, a striking resemblance to the client herself. "I didn't sit for it," she said at once, preempting the question that had already leapt to my lips. "I never wore such attire. And yet, it's me, down to the smallest feature." Holmes took the photograph from my hand and examined it without comment. I watched his eyes trace the edges, pausing at the folds of the veil, the tilt of the woman's chin. "And you discovered this after his death?" "Yes. It was hidden, almost carelessly so. And the canvas itself. It's gone. I searched the house. It's nowhere to be found. This image is all that remains." The figure in the painting, though shrouded in black, radiated a haunting presence. There was a quiet grief in the expression, but also something defiant, even theatrical. Most disturbingly, it bore an uncanny likeness to the woman who now sat before us. "There's no signature," Holmes said, tapping the corner of the print, "and no date." "I wondered," she said slowly, "if it was meant as a portrait, or something else. A message, perhaps." "A message to whom?" I asked. She hesitated. "To himself, perhaps," she replied at last. "Or to me." Holmes said nothing, but his brow furrowed with that peculiar intensity I had come to associate with buried truths. "There's another detail," she added, more softly now. "The ring." "The ring?" Holmes echoed, not looking up. She raised her hand. Upon her finger sat a sapphire set in a delicate band of white gold. "Simon left it to me in his will. I received it only days after his passing." "Yet it appears," Holmes murmured, pointing again to the photograph, "on the finger of the woman in the painting." A silence fell. I admit the detail chilled me. If the portrait had truly been painted before his death, how had the ring appeared there? And if after, by whom? "It's uncanny," I said, "almost as though the artist foresaw—" "Not foresaw," Holmes interrupted. "Reflected." I turned to him. "You think he painted her as she is now, before she became it?" "No," he replied. "I think he painted what she was becoming. The paint merely dried before the truth had time to harden." Mrs. Templeton flinched, though it was too subtle for anyone less familiar with human tension than Holmes to notice. He became distant in those last weeks, she confessed. Consumed. There was always a project, always a muse. But this time it was different. He wouldn't let me in the studio. He locked the door. And when he did speak of the painting, he referred to it not as a portrait, but as... She stopped, then finished in a whisper. An exorcism. Fascinating, Holmes muttered. Do you think it meant something? She asked, genuinely now. That painting, that woman. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment. All paintings mean something, but some mean more than they intend. As she stood to leave, Holmes reached for his pipe but paused, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. He turned to me with a half smile. Turpentine, he murmured. And fresh linseed. I glanced up. You mean the studio? No, Watson. I mean her shawl. I looked closer, and indeed a faint, acrid note clung to the fabric, familiar to anyone who had spent time near paints. Holmes's gaze flicked to her right hand. A small callus adorned her index finger. She never claimed to be an artist, he said once she had gone, but her hands speak otherwise. Holmes had not yet risen from his chair when he called out, One last question, madam, if you please. She turned in the doorway. Was your husband left-handed or right? A blink. Then, too quickly, right. Of course, Holmes said with a nod. And you are certain? Quite. He smiled faintly. How fortunate. For the woman in that painting wears her ring on the right hand. Good day to you, Mrs. Templeton. She hesitated, then bowed and left. The door clicked shut behind her. I turned to him. You don't believe her? I believe, he said, relighting his pipe, that the canvas lies far less than the woman did. Holmes and I made our way to Hampstead the following afternoon. The fog, still persistent, hung about the rooftops like an aging ghost reluctant to depart. As our cab pulled up before the Templeton residence, I was struck at once by the building's appearance, not unkempt, but strangely muted, as though the very bricks were holding their breath. We were greeted not by a servant, but by the widow herself, who met us on the front step with a solemn nod and a bundle of keys clutched in her gloved hand. The constable has already been, she informed us without prompting, but nothing was found. Holmes made no reply, only inclined his head and followed her inside. The house was tidy, too tidy, every cushion in place, every paper stacked, every flower long since removed. There was no smell of oil paint, no turpentine in the air, nothing of the disarray one might expect in the home of a working artist. When we reached the studio door on the second floor, she hesitated. It's been locked since the night since it happened, she said. May I? Holmes asked, already taking the key from her. The door resisted slightly, then yielded with a groan. Holmes paused on the threshold. Grief, he murmured, is rarely this organized. The room was small, square, and suffocatingly clean. Shafts of grey light slanted in from a high window, illuminating the wooden floorboards in strips of muted gold. Holmes stepped forward at once, crouching low, his eyes scanning the floor with the intensity of a man reading a foreign language. He secretly spoke fluently. Watson, he said suddenly, pointing to a pale rectangular patch near the centre of the room. Do you see? I followed his finger. An easel once stood there. Quite so. Recently removed, judging by the freshness of the outline. The rest of the dust here is settled and undisturbed. But this, he ran a finger across the clean space, was moved no more than a week ago. He rose and turned to the wall behind the patch. And curiously, the wall is unmarked. I blinked. You mean to say there's no trace of what was painted? Precisely. An artist this methodical leaves no wall untouched. And yet, Here we have an absence, a clean absence. The word hung in the room like a second ghost. Holmes moved to the window and studied the sill, then dropped to his knees once more. He ran his hand slowly along the floorboards beneath, his eyes narrowing. "There's more," he said. "What do you see?" "A trail," he muttered, "but an aborted one." Indeed, when I knelt beside him, I saw it too. A series of faint drag marks in the dust, as if something had been pulled across the floor, but stopped abruptly, less than halfway to the door. "It begins here," Holmes said, indicating the space where the easel had stood, "but ends here, 10 feet short of exit. Curious. Perhaps it was simply lifted. Possibly. Or perhaps," he said, rising, "someone wished to erase only part of the truth, enough to confuse, but not enough to remove it altogether." He walked to the far corner and tapped a panel in the wainscoting. "Hollow," he noted. "Empty, of course, but intentionally so." I felt again that prickling sense I often experienced in Holmes's presence, of truth hovering just out of reach, waiting for him to draw it out like a magician pulling silk from the air. And then he turned to me, eyes sharp. "The trail ends, Watson, but the story does not." It was shortly after our inspection of the studio that Holmes asked to see the apprentice. The young man, a pale and nervous boy of perhaps 19, introduced himself as Alfred Cole. He wore a painter's smock that bore more starch than stain, and his hands fidgeted with the hem of it as he spoke. I've worked with Mr. Templeton these past 8 months, he stammered. "He was kind to me, sir. Not easy, but fair. He didn't deserve to, well, go like that." Holmes motioned for him to continue. "You were familiar with his most recent work?" Alfred nodded. "Yes, sir, though he kept that last one, The Widow, quite private. Wouldn't let me in the room while he worked on it." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "So you knew of it before his death?" "Oh, yes, I saw him sketching it months ago. It frightened him, I think." "Why so?" Alfred hesitated. "Because it looked like her, sir, like Mrs. Templeton, but before he ever painted her, before she wore black." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. The boy had not merely confirmed the painting's early origin, but hinted at a dread we had not yet understood. As Alfred departed, I took the opportunity to speak privately with the housekeeper, a lean woman of advanced years, who regarded me with the faint suspicion common among long-serving domestic staff. "Begging your pardon, Doctor," she said, "but I think Mr. Templeton was not in his right mind toward the end." "In what way?" I asked. She looked over her shoulder and lowered her voice. "He stopped sleeping. Said he heard footsteps when no one walked. Claimed someone was watching him." "Watching? From where?" She hesitated. "From the mirror, sir." I confess the statement struck me more than I expected. "The mirror?" "Yes," she said. "He covered it once, then uncovered it again. Stared into it for hours. Told me he could see a woman there, weeping, but not moving." I said nothing. Holmes had often noted how madness and genius often slept uneasily in the same bed. "Did he say who she was?" I asked. She shook her head. "He only called her the Morning Face." I left her then, heart faintly unsettled. For once I hoped Holmes would dismiss the tale as nonsense, but his silence spoke otherwise. Back in the studio, Holmes moved with new urgency. He approached the shelf where Templeton had kept his brushes, paints, and palettes. Without a word, he selected a brush at random and inspected the bristles, then another and another. "All untouched," he muttered. "No fresh residue, no streaking, all arranged as if for show." "You mean he wasn't painting?" "Oh, he painted. Once," Holmes replied. "But not recently. These tools have been staged. Someone wanted to create the illusion of continued work." "But why?" I asked. "To make us think the painting was finished closer to the time of his death, he said, when in truth, it was likely completed, then concealed, long before. He examined the oil tubes next. Barely squeezed. Whoever touched these last had no intention of creating anything, only of implying that something had been created. Then the painting's disappearance is deliberate, but not recent. Someone wanted to erase its origin, not its existence. I frowned. To make it look like a recent obsession, rather than an older warning. Holmes gave a tight smile. Just so, Watson. You're learning. I wished I felt comforted by the compliment. We descended the stairs in silence, the house oddly noiseless behind us. Outside, the Hampstead fog had grown thicker, curling like smoke along the garden path. As we approached the gate, Holmes paused, gazing absently at the wrought iron fence. Then, almost idly, he said, "It is curious, Watson, how often one forgets the frame." "The frame?" I echoed. "Yes, in art we are trained to look at the subject, the face, the figure, the light. But the frame, we ignore it. And yet it borders truth, defines it, hides things behind it." "You think the answer lies in the painting's frame?" "I think," he replied, "that frames, when tampered with, often reveal what a canvas cannot, especially when the canvas has been replaced." He stepped out into the street and hailed a passing cab, leaving me with that cryptic remark ringing in my ears. And for the first time since the widow's visit, I began to suspect that we were not chasing a portrait at all, but the painter's final cry for help. 3 days later, Holmes summoned me to Montague Street with a telegram containing only 6 words. "You shall find her in blue." I arrived at the appointed gallery, modest, cluttered and perfumed with linseed, and found him already in quiet conversation with the proprietor, a grey-bearded man who spoke in reverent tones of brushwork and composition. Holmes waved me over to a corner near the back wall. "Observe," he said, pointing not at a canvas directly, but at the label beside it. It read, "The Mourner in Blue, Artist J.M. Fontenoy." I turned to the painting. There she was, the veiled figure, again, unmistakable in posture and poise. But her robes were navy, not black. Her hands were bare. Most strikingly, the sapphire ring was absent. "I don't understand," I said. "It's the same painting, and yet not." "Because it is not the same," Holmes replied. "It is the first." The gallery owner confirmed that The Mourner in Blue had arrived months earlier under its pseudonymous signature and had remained unsold. Holmes requested a viewing of the back, and with reluctant hands, the proprietor obliged. No date, but a familiar smudge of Templeton's known pigment, ochre he alone favoured, lay tucked beneath the frame. Holmes turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Simon Templeton," he said, "knew how to hide in plain sight." We stood before the 2 images that day, one in hand, the other on the wall, and compared them as surgeons might compare twin anomalies of the heart. Holmes moved between them like a priest decoding ritual, every gesture deliberate. "Note the eyes," he said. "In the gallery piece they are downcast, but in the photograph Mrs. Templeton showed us, the eyes meet the viewer, boldly. She does not mourn, she confronts." "And the hand," I added. "No ring here, but there—" "Yes," Holmes said, "the infamous sapphire. But its presence is the key, not the ornament." "I don't follow." He turned to me. "One was painted before the inheritance, the other afterwards. The former, truth, the latter, performance." I considered this. "Then who painted the second?" "That," he said softly, "is what we are here to determine. But the signature on the first, Fontenoy, is one of Simon's pseudonyms. He used it years ago when submitting anonymously to critics who had once mocked him." Then Simon painted both? Holmes hesitated. He painted one. The second, maybe an imitation, an echo of guilt, or a clever cover for something more sinister. The question of authorship weighed heavily on Holmes, but it was the matter of identity which seized his interest next. We returned to Baker Street where, with practiced fingers and a stack of old legal directories, Holmes undertook one of his most quietly devastating forms of investigation, the public record search. "Watson," he said, after an hour of page-turning, "can you locate a marriage certificate between one Simon Augustus Templeton and a Lavinia Ann Hardwick?" I searched, found nothing, searched again, still nothing. "Odd," I said. "She spoke as his wife." "She played the part," Holmes corrected, "but records care little for theatre." A visit to Somerset House confirmed the absence. No record of marriage, no licence issued, no union registered under either name. Holmes lit his pipe. "Then the question, my dear doctor, is not why she came to us, but why she presumed we wouldn't look." "But the will?" I asked. "She received the ring." "Indeed, and that too was forged, or more precisely forced, by a witness no longer able to contradict." He tossed me a set of ink-rubbed papers, comparisons of handwriting, all with the same precise slant, save for one. The signature upon the will, unmistakably feminine in its flourish. "She forged it?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "She played the widow to perfection, because she had studied her lines long before the curtain rose." "But why such effort to pose as his widow?" I asked as we returned to the flat, our cab rattling over the cobbled streets. Holmes answered without looking at me. "Because the part had once been hers." He handed me an old clipping from the Illustrated London News. It bore the photograph of a woman, younger, but unmistakably the same. Beneath it, Elise Hawthorne, wife of artist Simon Templeton, missing since 1889. "Elise," I whispered. "His first and only wife," Holmes said. "Declared missing 5 years ago. No body ever found. No death declared. Merely gone. And now returned, in a manner of speaking." The records, as Holmes showed me, confirmed that Elise had once modelled for Simon's earliest works, mysterious figures in mourning, always with veils, always watching. Her disappearance had been quietly dismissed at the time as a domestic matter, though some had whispered of jealousy, obsession, and madness in the Templeton household. "It is my belief," Holmes said, "that Elise returned not only with a new name, but a new persona, Lavinia. She did not reclaim her identity. She repainted it." I sat back, stunned. "Then the woman who came to us is both widow and wife, victim and forger. And if my suspicions are correct, perhaps something worse." It was just after supper that Holmes requested a return visit to the Templeton house. He made no explanation, merely requested I bring my revolver, "for ballast, Watson, not bullets," and arranged for us to arrive unannounced. The widow, if she was surprised by our reappearance, masked it well. She claimed to have retired early, but allowed us entry without protest. Holmes offered her no explanation, only a nod before ascending the stairs once more. The studio had not changed. Holmes moved directly to the far cabinet, which had previously escaped both our notice and the constable's. He ran his fingers beneath it, knelt, and let out a quiet exclamation. From the shadowed floor, he extracted a flat, unframed sheet of paper, yellowed, creased, and rendered in charcoal. He placed it in my hands. My breath caught. It was her, veiled, solemn, eyes lowered. But unlike the previous paintings, this figure had her hands clasped at her chest, and on her right hand, not the left, was the distinctive outline of a ring, the sapphire ring. "There," Holmes said softly, "the first draft, Or perhaps the confession. I examined the face again. There was something raw in the sketch, unfinished and thus more honest. A tension in the lips, a shadow near the cheek, less performance, more truth. Holmes took the sketch and rolled it carefully. She never meant for this to be seen, and yet, like all buried truths, it clawed its way back. Later that evening, Holmes unfurled the sketch once more beneath the lamplight and placed it beside a copy of the newspaper clipping we had obtained, Elise Hawthorne from 5 years prior. He said nothing for several minutes, allowing the image to settle in my mind. And indeed, the resemblance was no longer merely speculative. The arch of the brow, the curve of the jaw, even the faint asymmetry at the corner of the mouth, matched in both sketch and photograph. She drew herself, Holmes murmured. Or was drawn by Simon, I said. He nodded. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. What matters is that the face in this drawing is not one invented. It is remembered. And you believe it proves Lavinia is Elise? Holmes's reply was slow. It proves she is someone who remembers Elise intimately, whether as herself or as the shadow she left behind. That is what we must determine. The thought unnerved me. It was one thing to encounter a woman with a secret, quite another to chase a ghost wearing her skin. It was past midnight when Holmes returned the sketch to his desk drawer and stood by the fire, pipe between his lips, gaze distant. You've been unusually quiet, I said. He nodded. Because what I suspect cannot yet be proven, and I detest speculation without precision. Then what do you know? I know, he said, that the woman who calls herself Lavinia Templeton has rewritten her past with exquisite brushwork, and forgotten that canvas can be altered, but frames remain constant. He tapped the fireplace mantel with his pipe. Frames, Watson. They are constructed to protect. But in doing so, they betray. They are cut to size, joined at angles. If anything is hidden, it is hidden behind the frame, not the painting. Then we must examine the frame? We shall, he said, turning at last, but not tonight. He extinguished the lamp and left me staring at the smouldering coals, mind still troubled by his words. In truth, I felt that we were no longer investigating a death, but peeling back the portrait of a woman who had erased herself with deliberate artistry. And somewhere in the corners of that frame, the original brushstrokes were beginning to show through. It was on a Thursday afternoon, under a grey November sky, that Holmes arranged what he termed an exhibition of moderate artistic curiosity at our Baker Street rooms. I had long since learned not to question the peculiar euphemisms Holmes employed when laying his snares, but even I was struck by the precision of his preparations. A modest card had been delivered to no more than 5 individuals, critics, painters, and one gallery proprietor. And among the invited was Mrs. Lavinia Templeton. You mean to confront her here? I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. No, Watson. I mean to let her confront herself. The parlour had been rearranged slightly, a velvet cover draped over an upright frame at the centre of the room. Holmes refused to allow me even a glance beneath it. She must see it first, he said. The reaction must be pure, unpracticed. The guests arrived in staggered form, their polite interest piqued more by Holmes's name than the promise of the painting. But when Mrs. Templeton entered, still veiled, still composed, I observed the faintest rigidity in Holmes's frame. He offered her a nod. You honour us, madam, he said, gesturing toward the draped canvas. May I present, at last, the truth behind the brush? He pulled the cloth aside. There was a beat of silence so taut it seemed the very gaslight held its breath. Then came the smallest intake of air, from Mrs. Templeton. She stared at the frame, unmoving. For a moment, I thought she would speak. But no. She took a single step forward and studied it. It was not a painting at all. It was a mirror. Set within the original frame from Simon Templeton's studio, polished to a spectral sheen, the mirror reflected back the room, its guests, the fire, Holmes, and finally, the veiled woman herself. But it was not the glass that drew the eye. It was the letter. Pressed into the corner of the frame was a folded envelope, sealed in red wax, bearing one inscription: "To whomever finds the truth." She made no move to touch it. Holmes spoke quietly. "A curious hiding place for correspondence. Would you not agree, madam?" She looked at him, her poise trembling for the first time. "You had no right." "Ah," Holmes interjected, "but Simon Templeton did. He placed it there, I believe, on the day he realized you had returned. Not as Elise, not as Lavinia, but as both." Her eyes flashed. "You presume too much." "And you," Holmes replied coldly, "have presumed no one would ever find the frame." Holmes plucked the letter from its place with deliberate care. He did not break the seal at once, but turned it slowly between his fingers. "The mirror was inserted later," he explained to the room, "but the frame is original, Templeton's own, carved and finished in his workshop. When we removed the backing, we discovered a thin recess carved into the moulding, a perfect fit for this envelope." He looked to Mrs. Templeton. "Do you deny it?" She said nothing. Holmes cracked the seal and unfolded the parchment. The wax gave with a sigh, as though relieved to surrender its burden. He read aloud, "To whomever finds this, I write not to accuse, but to confess fear. My wife, Elise, has returned. She does not say so, but I know it. She bears a different name, a different voice, even a different past. But the eyes are the same, the lies are the same, and I believe she means to finish what she began years ago." At that, Mrs. Templeton turned away. A tightness had overtaken her figure. She clasped her hands in front of her. Still no words. Holmes continued, "She watches me now, not from doorways, but from the glass. Her mourning is costume, her touch cold. She paints nothing but illusion." Holmes folded the letter once more. "And yet," he said, "he left it here. Not to escape her, but to expose her." There was a hush that followed Holmes's reading, a silence more eloquent than any gasp. Then Mrs. Templeton spoke, her voice low and measured. "Is that all?" she asked. Holmes met her gaze. "That depends. Is there more?" "I came to you," she said. "I brought the painting. I asked for help." "You brought us a copy," Holmes said. "You buried the original." "And what if I did?" she snapped suddenly. "He was mad, Mr. Holmes. You read his words. Ghosts in mirrors, women reborn. Is that sanity?" "Grief distorts," Holmes agreed, "but it rarely fabricates entire documents hidden in custom-built frames." She turned to me now. "Dr. Watson, surely even you must see, this proves nothing. No crime, no motive." "But a motive," Holmes interjected, "is sometimes painted in silence." He gestured to the frame. "Simon Templeton was a man pursued, not by law, but by memory. And I suspect he painted you, again and again, not as muse, but as warning." She said nothing. Holmes took a step closer. Why forge the marriage record? Why falsify the will? Why hide the original frame? Her composure faltered, just slightly. "Because he owed me. He left me with nothing." "No," Holmes said quietly. "He left you with a portrait. You merely tried to repaint it." Holmes turned toward her then, not with menace, but with the cold detachment of a surgeon about to cut deep. "You are not his widow," he said, "because you were never his wife." The words struck the room like a bell. Even the fire seemed to falter in its crackle. Lavinia Templeton's face remained composed. but her gloved hands clutched each other now with visible force. "I forged nothing," she said. "He loved me. That is what matters." "And yet," Holmes continued, drawing a folded document from his breast pocket, "this marriage license, submitted with the will, bears a signature in your own hand, a hand I've now compared against correspondence you sent Simon under your former name, Elise Hawthorne. The flourishes are identical, the loops exaggerated, and more tellingly, you signed for the registrar with a fountain pen that was not introduced until a year after the supposed wedding." She paled, but said nothing. "Simon suspected you from the start," Holmes pressed. "He knew the woman who re-entered his life was not simply a ghost. She was a forger, a performer, a manipulator. And when he refused to relegate you to the past, you brought the past forward, under a new name, with new lies." "Stop," she whispered. "He would not marry you again, so you married him in ink." She looked at the letter still in Holmes's hand, and for the first time I saw the edges of her defiance fray. Not in fear, but in the raw, bleeding wound of exposure. Before Holmes could continue, a sound broke the tension, a muffled sob, sharp and strangled. It came not from Lavinia, but from the far corner of the parlour, where young Alfred Cole, Simon's apprentice, had been seated quietly until now, overlooked by most. "I didn't mean to," he gasped. "I didn't mean to kill him." The room turned as one. Alfred stood now, trembling, eyes red and voice cracking. "She said he'd hurt her again, that he'd lied to her, that he'd ruined her before and would do it again. I loved her, I did, and she said..." Lavinia turned sharply. "You fool," she hissed. "I told you to wait. I told you..." Alfred collapsed to his knees, sobbing into his hands. He was shouting at her. I thought he'd strike her, so I only meant to pull him away. He slipped." Holmes's voice was measured. "You pushed him." "I didn't mean... He fell. The balcony rail gave. He screamed once." "And the frame?" Holmes asked. Alfred looked up, ashamed. "She made me take the painting. She said to hide the real one, destroy the easel, clean the brushes. I did it for her." Lavinia stared at him with something between contempt and pity. "You poor, stupid boy," she said. It was not denial, it was resignation. The crowd began to disperse quietly after that, led gently toward the door by a constable Holmes had summoned hours before. Lavinia offered no resistance. She stood silent, her chin slightly raised, a widow in posture if not in truth. When the room had emptied, I turned to Holmes. "Well?" I said softly. That took a turn. Holmes nodded, his gaze still fixed on the frame now leaning against the wall. "She never killed him," I said, "and yet she caused his death." "Quite," Holmes replied. "And yet her performance was nearly perfect. The painting, the pose, the veil. But in art, Watson, even the most convincing likeness reveals a flaw." He tapped the corner of the frame. "It was not the widow that cracked," he murmured. "It was the frame." I turned to him. "And Alfred." "A weapon forged by emotion, wielded by deception," Holmes said. "He thought himself a knight. In truth, a pawn." He fell into a quiet reverie then, and I did not interrupt it. Outside, the street lamps flickered in the mist, and I was left with the uneasy feeling that the most dangerous disguises are those that require no mask, only memory. In the days that followed, the case of Simon Templeton's death was duly recorded as manslaughter, though public curiosity barely stirred. Lavinia, or rather Elise, was quietly committed on charges of fraud and conspiracy, while young Alfred was remanded with mercy, his confession having rendered further inquiry unnecessary. Holmes, for his part, returned the mirror frame to the Templeton estate with no flourish, remarking only that it belonged with the rest of the unanswered questions. As I penned the final notes in my journal, I found myself returning to Holmes's words, that it was not the widow who cracked, but the frame. It struck me that in this case, the truth had not hung on a fingerprint or footprint, but on a border, the space that defines art and yet conceals it. The portrait was gone, but the shadow remained. And somewhere behind the glass, I imagined Simon Templeton still watching, perhaps not with vengeance, but with the quiet, tired sadness of a man who had seen too much, too late. When the final constable had departed and the room lay quiet once more, Holmes remained standing at the hearth, pipe unlit in one hand, the mirror frame propped against the bookcase like a retired performer. I had begun to suspect her from the moment she removed her gloves, he said at last, his tone mild, as if speaking of the weather. How so? I asked, though the question was more ritual than inquiry. The residue, he replied, a faint blue-grey smear beneath her right thumbnail. At first glance, it could have been dust, but dust does not cling to clean leather. It was pigment, Prussian blue, most likely, of the sort used by oil painters to undercoat mourning garments. But she claimed never to have touched Simon's work, I said. Indeed, he nodded. Yet the right index finger bore a callus, shallow but fresh, consistent with brushwork, and there was a faint aroma upon her shawl, turpentine and linseed, subtle but unmistakable. He moved to the desk and took up a folded cloth. A woman in mourning may wear black, he said, but paint on the gloves betrays an artist, or at the very least someone attempting to impersonate one. And so you knew? I knew she had lied, Holmes said, and that Simon Templeton had painted his widow, months before she ever wore the veil. Holmes removed a folder from the cabinet and spread its contents on the table. There are absences which speak louder than presence, Watson. One such is a missing license. He handed me the document again, now annotated in Holmes's own hand. The marriage certificate bore the names Simon Templeton and Lavinia Hardwick, dated 2 years prior. Authentic looking, no doubt, Holmes said, but this paper was never filed. Somerset House shows no record, no banns, no license, no clergy, nothing. I examined the seal. Forgery. A careful one, Holmes said, but a forgery nonetheless. The ink is not government standard. The registrar's signature is fictitious. And here, he tapped a flourish in the L of Lavinia, a telltale link to Elise Hawthorne's correspondence from 5 years past. He laid out 2 letters side by side. The similarity was plain, the same looping descender, the same confident slant. She forged not only a name, Holmes said, but a history. And the will, I asked, filed under false pretenses. The court accepted it only because no one challenged her claim. Who would dare question a weeping widow, especially one whose likeness graced her late husband's final work? Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe at last. She did not become Mrs. Templeton, he said. She portrayed her. Then Lavinia never existed, I asked. Holmes exhaled a slow cloud of smoke. Not as a legal identity, but as a persona, crafted, worn, and performed. She existed quite vividly. He leaned back and steepled his fingers. Elise Hawthorne vanished 5 years ago under circumstances most unusual. No official separation, no divorce, no grave. Simply gone. At the time, her disappearance was attributed to marital strain and artistic eccentricity. But it was more than that. She had grown tired of being the muse. She wanted to be the master. And so she left? Precisely. And when she returned, she did not seek forgiveness. She sought ownership. She reinvented herself, not as Elise, broken and dismissed, but as Lavinia, elegant, bereaved, and entitled. Holmes stood and retrieved the charcoal sketch from his drawer. Simon recognized her, of course. The eyes rarely lie, but he did not confront her. He feared her. And so he painted her again, not as a tribute, but as a record. The sketch? I asked. The first attempt, unfinished, honest. The final painting, however, was a performance piece, a message encrypted in oils, hiding the truth behind layers of sorrow. I looked again at the veiled face, now familiar and yet still elusive. She came to us, I said, with a mystery she had orchestrated. And nearly succeeded, Holmes replied. But the cracks began not in her alibi, but in the varnish. Holmes moved to the desk once more and unfolded the final sheet. Alfred's written confession, smudged with ink and tremulous with remorse. The boy was not her accomplice, he said. He was her instrument. I nodded grimly. She never touched Simon. Exactly. She stoked Alfred's affections, fed him tales of abuse, betrayal, and threats, positioned herself as the wronged woman, and him as the gallant protector. In his eyes, she was both muse and martyr. Holmes tapped the paper. And when the moment came, when Simon raised his voice, perhaps nothing more, Alfred acted. He pushed him. Yes, not in malice, but in fervour. He believed he was rescuing her. Instead, he became her alibi. Holmes laid the confession beside the will. She used him to remove Simon, and then she used Simon's name to claim what remained. But why paint at all? I asked. Why the widow in mourning? Because stories require symbols, Watson. She knew her likeness on canvas would lend credence to her claim. It was proof without scrutiny, and the ring, painted upon her hand before it was ever given, was not oversight. It was premonition. Holmes exhaled through his nose. She orchestrated every brushstroke, every forged letter, every tear. She was not content to be remembered. She sought to be inherited. I shivered slightly, though the room was warm. There is cruelty in cold calculation. But in Elise's case, it was painted in strokes of velvet. Holmes placed the photograph of the painting beside the rolled charcoal sketch, and then next to it, the confession. One by one, the artifacts of a tragedy staged in oils and deceit. You see, Watson, he said, tapping the portrait. This was not a painting of grief. It was a painting of guilt, Simon's guilt and Elise's manipulation. But why paint her at all? I asked again, though the question had haunted me from the beginning. Why immortalize the one person he feared? To be remembered, Holmes said, not as a fool, but as a man who saw through the lie. He rose and moved to the mirror, still resting within the frame. She did not kill him with poison or blade. She killed him with remembrance, with the return of a role she had long abandoned. And yet, he resisted. He left behind this, the painting, the frame, the letter. His final attempt to warn the world of the illusion he could not escape. Holmes turned the mirror toward the wall. This is not a portrait, he said. It is a mask removed. And what lies behind it is not sorrow, but strategy. I watched him, struck as ever by the strange poetry that sometimes emerged from beneath his cool logic. The painted widow, he said softly, was never mourning. She was rehearsing. Holmes poured himself a second measure of whiskey that evening, which was, by his standards, practically a celebration. I, however, had remained on edge throughout, and it was not long before my exasperation bubbled over. You knew, I said at last. You knew from the moment she stepped into the room that something was amiss. And yet you told me nothing. I told you everything you needed, Holmes replied without looking up. Had I told you more, you would have asked questions I wasn't prepared to answer. But I could have, should have, been brought in. You allowed me to stumble through the house, speak with the apprentice, console the woman, while you played 5 moves ahead. He looked at me then with a faint smile. You did so admirably, Watson. That is not the point. Holmes leaned back. Would you believe me more, my dear fellow, if I shouted my theories from the rooftop? No, I said sharply. But a warning would have been nice. He laughed, genuinely, which startled me more than a scream might have. There it is. The famous Watson indignation. I missed it. I sighed. And what of the girl, Elise? She will be punished, Holmes said, but not for the full measure of her crime. The law cannot sentence for manipulation. I refilled my glass, muttering, it should. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows against the shelves. Holmes stared into the grate, his profile carved in flickering orange. Do you know what fascinated me most, Watson? He asked softly. I daren't guess. That she convinced herself of her own story, the veil, the ring, the morning voice. She believed it all. It was not merely deception, it was identity rewritten. I said nothing. There was a sadness in his tone I rarely heard. The human mind, he continued, is capable of great precision. But the heart is a far more reckless painter. It smudges, it idealizes, it replaces truth with what it longs to be real. And Simon? I asked. He saw it, Holmes said. And in the end, he feared that seeing would not be enough. So he painted, he framed, he buried his warning where only another pattern seeker would find it. He tapped the edge of the mirror frame, now turned to the wall. And Alfred? A casualty, he said, of love misplaced, of purpose borrowed. He did not kill with hate. He killed for a story he did not write. We sat in silence a moment longer. And yet, I said, you still believe in deduction. Holmes's reply was soft. Because, Watson, when truth is painted over, someone must learn to see through the varnish. It was the following evening when I found Holmes once more ensconced in his armchair, the fire reduced to quiet embers, and the windows glazed with thin trails of autumn rain. The mist outside clung to the panes like a patient ghost, blurring the gaslight of Baker Street into soft halos. Holmes had not touched his violin, nor reached for his tobacco. Instead, he sat utterly still, one leg crossed, fingers steepled before his lips. He stared not at me, nor at the hearth, but at the space just above the mantelpiece, as though revisiting a canvas only he could see. I let him sit in silence for some time, unwilling to intrude upon his rare state of reflection. There was no restlessness in him, no sardonic twitch of amusement, only something quieter, something colder. The case had concluded. Elise Hawthorne, alias Lavinia, was in custody. Alfred had confessed. Simon Templeton's final message had been retrieved and understood. And yet, even with justice served and the deception unveiled, Holmes did not seem victorious. It was the sort of silence one finds not after a storm, but after a symphony. Beautiful, precise, complete, and profoundly sad. At length, Holmes stirred and spoke, his voice low as though addressing the mist rather than me. There is something peculiar about art, Watson, he said. A portrait may reflect the present, but prophecy lies in the stroke of intention. I set aside my writing and glanced toward him. You believe Simon meant it as a warning? Not only that, I believe he knew his own story was ending, and rather than speak it aloud, he painted it, not to preserve his image, but to preserve the truth. He rose slowly and stepped toward the mirror frame propped once again against the wall. Some men build monuments, others leave behind journals. Templeton left us a riddle in oils, and like all true riddles, it carried its answer within the question. I said nothing, unsure whether to comfort or commend him. He tried to tell the world who she was, Holmes continued, but in doing so, he also told us who he had become, a man who saw clearly, but far too late. He returned to his chair, his hands folded. There is a cruelty, he added softly, in beauty that knows it lies. As I prepared my notes, arranging the particulars for what would become this record, Holmes tilted his head slightly and regarded me with that familiar expression, half bemusement, half appraisal. "You'll write it, of course," he said. "You always do." "Of course," I replied, "though I'm not certain how one writes justice into brushstrokes." He offered a faint smile. "You'll find a way. You always do." There was a pause, then a faint clatter as he reached for the tea I'd set down earlier, now grown lukewarm. "Next time," he said dryly, "remind me to buy canvas, not clients." I laughed in spite of myself. Outside, the rain began to ease and the gaslights resumed their full glow across the slick cobblestones. I thought of Elise, of the elegance she wore like armour, and of Simon, who died trying to paint the truth he could no longer speak. In the end, the lies were grand, the motives tragic, and the strokes deliberate. But as Holmes had so often reminded me, deception, however artfully rendered, is still deception. And the sharpest truths, like the finest portraits, are rarely recognized until the light changes. It was then, as I set my pen aside, that a knock came at the door, 3 times, firm but unhurried. Holmes did not move. He merely looked toward the hallway, as though expecting it. "I believe he said, "that our next appointment has arrived." The door creaked open, and a man stepped forward, his coat damp with rain, his face pale, and on his collar a vivid blot of crimson that was not wine. Holmes stood. "Come in," he said, "and kindly tell us who bled, and why." The Painted Widow was behind us, but the next canvas was already waiting. The full script for Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Painted Widow is now complete, in tone, structure, and length. It mirrors the elegance and suspense of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's original canon. Would you like the full story delivered as a formatted document, or continue with a new case? Absolutely. Here is a compelling, well-structured ending that follows your precise framework, reflecting Conan Doyle's tone, tying back to the core mystery of the Case of the Painted Widow, and prompting both reflection and engagement. As we watched the rain slide down the glass, like the ghost of a forgotten signature, Holmes stirred in his chair and said, "It is a curious thing, Watson, how often those who forge identity leave behind the one truth they cannot disguise: intent." He tapped the frame of the mirror absently. "She painted herself into a life that never belonged to her, but it was the frame, the border meant to hold illusion, that revealed her." I looked up from my journal. "You think it was pride that undid her?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Pride? Perhaps, but more than that, the belief that truth, once hidden behind beauty, ceases to matter. A dangerous conviction, my dear Watson, and nearly a perfect one. What do you think was her greatest mistake? Trusting the boy, forging the marriage, or painting the lie one stroke too well? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Was justice truly served in the end, or was it merely framed to look like it? If you enjoyed this case, do subscribe for more original Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And don't forget to share this story with a friend who appreciates a well-placed clue. Until the next case, keep your eyes sharp and your deductions sharper.